Hello and good evening to everyone. Today's session is day 9 and week 3. Today we will continue with 3.5 management of change. So 3.4 is about assessing risk and so yesterday we completed 3.4 where we discussed on the risk assessment steps. So step 1 is where we identify the hazards. So hazards are anything that has the potential to cause harm in the workplace. So, for example, if we are doing a risk assessment for an office based business, we identify what are the potential hazards that may cause harm from the office activities. Okay. And then we identify who might be harmed and how. So, some hazards may only cause harm to the people who are carrying out the activities. Okay, but still there are other hazards which may cause harm to other people just because they are in the vicinity. So it can include other than the workers, any contractors on your site or visitors, or any other external interested parties or cleaning maintenance staff. So you're going to consider anybody who might be potentially harmed from the hazards that we identify in step 1. And then we evaluate the risk. So to evaluate, we need to identify what is the likelihood of the identified hazard may cause harm, and if it causes harm, what would be the severity level. So by understanding the likelihood and severity, we will re-evaluate the risk. Okay, so the risk could be evaluated as low, medium, high, or very high, or whether the risk is estimated as acceptable, tolerable, or unacceptable or intolerable. And then we record the findings, which is step 4. Okay, so a risk assessment should be documented, so all the key findings must be recorded. And step 5 is review and make changes when required. So it is a good practice for the risk assessment to be reviewed every 6 months or every 12 months depending on the nature of the activities. And following any changes or following an accident or any other undesired event, the assessment must be revised. So next, management of change, a very short topic. So management of change. So changes may bring both challenges and opportunities. Okay. So a, a change is something that is, will happen in any organizations, whether it is a change related to the key personnel or changes related to the the law or the technology, or changes related to the your overall process. So these changes are often driven by external influences or internal influences. Okay, so for example, this NEBOSH, digital assessment. It came into effect in August 2020. So, which was a change driven by external influences, which was the COVID pandemic. Okay. So, or it can also be driven by internal influences. So organizations, they should have an effective process that allows them to identify and to minimize the impact of change. So if a change is happening in an organization, and if the change is not, uh, clearly communicated to the workers, or if the change is not planned, then all this could lead to a poor implementation of the change, and the overall change process could also take much longer time than expected and could also lead to other unproductive hours. So by exploring the potential future development and anticipating associated risk and opportunities, organizations can be prepared for change. So these change can be considered where it could be a challenge or an opportunity. Okay. For example, you have a fleet of vehicles, and So now with these environmental, impact and other, in many countries where they are very much, bringing into the effect which will provide a sustainable environment. So these organizations, they may slowly transition from, from diesel to biofuel or from diesel to electrical vehicles. Okay. So this provides a challenge and also an opportunity. Okay, so when you're changing from diesel to electrical, there is an opportunity where you could save, operational cost from diesel to electricity, and you're also it is also providing an opportunity where you can, meet the regulatory requirements of reducing the carbon emissions from diesel vehicles. So developments may occur rapidly. Planning for emergency situation is essential. So organizational changes can happen, changes to key personnel roles, responsibilities, teams or departments, and then downsizing or outsourcing. So due to economic climate, so where you know due to a global depression, there could be, which could impact your business. Okay. So, for example, you might be operating in one country, but if there is any, you know, these geopolitical issues, like what is happening, the war. So it is directly impacting other countries in terms of, oil supply and other things. Okay. So any countries that is relying on it or any organization, so it could directly impact on them, and they may have to cut down their, their budget. They may reduce their, sizable workforce. Okay. Or they may outsource, to other contractors. So changes to administrative arrangements and working practices such as working hours, worker relocation. Okay, you might be changing your working premises. You might be moving your premises to another premises. Okay, and with the new premises, there could be some additional operational or safety risk, or any process or technical changes like new equipment, new materials, or changes to materials, packaging, or composition of material. So these changes are something that would happen at at some stage in an organization. So when a change is happening, there should be a planning, and people, they should clearly understand why this change is happening. Okay, so why are we moving our building premises, or why are we, downsizing the workforce, or why are we making changes within the department? Okay, or why are we introducing a new equipment? So people should clearly understand why this change is happening, or they may see this change as, something that would improve, provide an opportunity to further, improve their business, or provides an opportunity to reduce the existing, risk level. So if people understand the reason for the change, then there would be, equal participation from the workers for the smooth transition of the change. So step one, getting organized. A strong policy, a some or most organizations, they would have a change management policy. Okay, and then make senior level managers accountable. Clear change management procedure. The procedure must explain whenever there is a change. Okay, the procedure will explain how the change will be planned and implemented, or how the change will be communicated. Okay, so communicate and include everyone, review and challenge. And then step two, identify the people involved. So if the change is only affecting the individual team or the department, or the change is impacting the whole organization, so you're going to identify the people involved, and then you assess the risk. Okay, so if you are bringing planning or implementing this change, will this introduce new risk, or would this increase the existing risk level? So you need to carefully do the assessment, and then test scenarios Okay, so you test scenarios. For example, you're going to introduce a telematics system, okay, into your fleet of vehicles. Okay, so telematics is where you install a device in the vehicle, and the device will provide data. Okay, like for example, what is the speed driven by the driver, is there any harsh braking, are there any poor lane changes. So all this data will be collected through this telematic system. Okay, so now you introduce this for a very small number of vehicles. Okay, let's say you have 500 vehicles in your fleet. You don't want to install the telematic system in all the vehicles at once, so that could also have an operational risk. So you install first like for a 10 number of vehicles and see what are the challenges in the installation or running of those systems, and then slowly you increase your test scenarios. So if your test scenarios are satisfactory and as per the result, then you implement that through the whole fleet. And then amendment of emergency procedures. So because of this change, will there be any change in the existing emergency procedures? If so, then those amendments must be done. And then step three, provide enough resource to make the change safely. So if you require additional, people or manpower, then it should be clearly provided. Monitor risk during the change. Keep your plan under review. So if your change process is for a period of 3 months, then you have to clearly monitor how the change, whether the progress is happening, on a weekly term. And then review your change policy and provide adequate welfare provisions. So for example, in your office, let's say there are 50 number of people staff working, and suddenly there is an increase in the demand of your business, and you're expanding your team or expanding the workforce. So instead of 50, if there are 70 people is going to be occupied in the same layout of the office, so that may not provide an adequate a space for people to work, or you may not have adequate welfare facilities like toilet facilities or drinking areas. So all this will also need to be considered as part of the change management. So next is safe systems of work for general work activities. Okay. Now, safe system of work is an umbrella term. Okay. Sometimes when we say safe procedure or job instructions or method statements, okay, or so all this, it comes under the safe systems of work. So sometimes it can also be called as a safe procedure. Okay. So when we say a safe procedure or a safe system of work, okay. So for example, your risk assessment will help you to identify the risk and the controls. Okay. Whereas your safe system of work will tell you how to implement those controls. Okay. So it is a procedural document. So the procedural document tells you how to carry out or how to carry out the forklift truck, operations, or how to, carry out this manual handling activity, or how to carry out the welding work. So that is a safe system of work. Okay. So after completing the risk assessment for the welding activity, which identifies the risk and the controls, now you prepare what is the safe procedure to carry out this welding activity to ensure this activity is done safely without risk of harm to any people. Okay. So in some cases, it will tell you a step-by-step instructions that needs to be followed as part of the procedural document. So, why workers should be involved when developing safe systems of work? Okay. So, when you're developing a risk assessment or when you're developing a safe system of work, you must involve, you know, workers. So it's very much the same reason that we discussed about benefits of consultation. So when you're involving the worker, you're getting inputs, valuable source of information from the people who do the work. Okay, so they would help you to identify the hazards that you may have, missed, or they would help you to evaluate the adequacy of the existing controls, which will help you to target additional controls. Okay, so they will be able to describe in detail what needs to be done so that an appropriate procedure can be devised. Okay, so when people are involved in the procedure, there is a strong likelihood that those people will follow the procedure, because these procedures are developed based on their inputs. They will have ownership, and there is a high chance that they will follow and implement the procedure. So their involvement will help with the acceptance of a safe system of work once it is introduced. Okay. So why procedures should be recorded or written down? Okay. So these procedures, like your risk assessments, must be documented. Why? Now, some tasks are complex. Okay, so if it's a, let's say a procedure requires you to, follow the instructions in order, and there are like, it's a very complex task. Even if you miss one of the instructions or one of the step, it can lead into a chaotic. Okay, so it is important that the procedures are documented, and people, they would have a clarity when they're doing the task, so with potential serious consequences if steps are missed. So even if you miss one step in a procedure, if that could lead to a dangerous situation, it is important that the procedures are written down. A procedure backed up with the right training will be an ideal way of helping to ensure that the task is carried out the same way every time. Okay, so procedure is one document. Now there are different people who may be, following, implementing that procedure to carry out a certain task. So when different people, they use the same procedure to carry out the same task, there will be a consistency. Okay. So every time when someone is doing this task, they would follow the procedure, and every time, the procedure will be implemented likewise. So written procedures can relate to specific tasks to be performed or general aspects of health and safety, such as reporting incidents or auditing. Okay. So you can also prepare a procedure on how to report an incident. Okay, so when an incident happens, the procedure will tell you when, to whom you should report the incident, and by when you should report the incident, and after reporting the incident, how or where you should record the incident, or after recording the incident, how the incident will be investigated. So all this will, the procedure will tell you a detailed, a series of steps from recording to reporting to investigating and closing that incident. So procedures need to be realistic and reflect how the work is actually undertaken. So you should not prepare a procedure just because a procedure has to be done. It should be realistic. When someone is implementing that procedure, okay, it should be logical and practicable. Okay, you are not going to include any informations in the procedure that is not logical or impracticable. So procedures that are clear and well presented will be more likely to be understood and implemented. So people will implement the task only when they understand what they need to implement. So if the procedure is written in such a way that people cannot understand, then you cannot expect people to implement the same. So procedures set standards of performance for the task and mitigate the risk. So in short, you think about a safe system of work as a safe procedure. Okay, so you carry out a risk assessment, and then following the risk assessment, you prepare a safe procedure. So like I said, your risk assessment will identify the risk and the controls, but your procedure will tell you how to carry out that particular task you by using those controls, so that the work is done safely. So when developing a safe system of work, stage one is analyze the task, identifying hazards, assessing risk. Okay. So, breaking the job or task down into a sequence of actions that need to be carried out and how they need to be done to achieve the task objectives. So, you take any task and you break down the task into series of steps. For example, in the scenario where it is a warehouse, right? So it's a retail store that is located on the outskirts, and the store sells these products. And you see, the store is open to customers, and at the back of the store, through an automatic opening door, is a large warehouse. So at the back of the store, there is a large warehouse where they stock goods, and so warehouse workers they use forklift truck to move goods from delivery trucks into the warehouse, and then from the warehouse the goods are moved to the stores. So you could clearly see the process here. So the goods are delivered through the delivery trucks into the warehouse. From the warehouse they move the goods to the, so workers use forklift trucks to move goods from delivery trucks into the warehouse, and from the warehouse they move it to the store. Okay, so the now you can see this task you can break down into three different subtasks. One is delivery of trucks into the warehouse. Okay, so the loading area where the delivery trucks it arrives into the warehouse. So here you are going to identify the hazards associated with the vehicle movement. Okay, and then from the delivery truck you're going to dispatch the item into the warehouse through forklift truck. So here again you're going to identify the risk associated with the forklift truck activity. Okay, so here it can lead to forklift truck collision with the people, or the forklift truck may hit a fixed object, a forklift truck may overturn. Okay, so you're going to identify risk associated with forklift truck activity. And then the third is from the warehouse, you're moving the goods to the store. Okay. So for each of these subtasks, we need to identify what are the hazards and the actions to be carried out so that these subtasks are done safely. So identify the potential hazards, identify the control measures. So this is where you're doing your risk assessment. Okay. And then consider the effectiveness of control measures and what might impact the effectiveness. So first step is you do your risk assessment, and then you prepare your safe procedure. Okay. Now, step two is introducing controls and formulating the procedures. So, define safe and healthy methods. When we say a safe procedure or safe method, it should ensure that anybody who is implementing that procedure or method, the work must be done safely. Okay. So here, when deciding on the methods, consider the previous analysis. Okay, so previous analysis where, for example, from your incident data. Okay, so where are the areas of concern or problem areas? Consider that there are adequate controls are in place. Okay, consider that you're meeting the legal and the best practice standards are implemented, and then consider incorporating manufacturer or supplier instructions. So you are getting extracting data from different sources. Okay, from the regulatory documents, from any manufacturers or supplier, there from their instructions, from your previous analysis. Okay, and then you're defining the person in control of the work and responsibilities at various stages. Okay, so from arrival of the delivery truck, and then moving the goods to the warehouse. So you are going to clearly assign the different people who would be involved, what are the roles and responsibilities. So what is the role of the store manager? Okay, what is the role of the supervisor, or what is the role of the forklift truck operators? So all this will be clearly defined within your safe systems of work. Okay, so defining who does what, when, where, and how, and then defining the method as simply as possible to make it understandable to workers. So you try to avoid using jargon words or any technical words that may cause, that where workers may not able to understand. Okay, the purpose of the procedure is for people to understand what they do so that they implement it correctly, and then dealing with any likely emergencies. So during this activity, what are the foreseeable emergency situations, and then what procedures or arrangements must be in place to deal with those emergencies. So that should also be captured in your safe system of work. And then finally, instructions and training in operating the system. Okay. So simply issuing the procedure through company intranet or similar and expecting compliance is unlikely to be effective. Okay. You develop the procedure and then you share the procedure to the concerned people, that doesn't ensure the procedure will be implemented. Okay. So here you need to communicate what is there in the procedure. Okay, so when a safe system of work presents a change to a well established way of working, it is essential that adequate communication and training are put in place to support adoption of the new system. So use a variety of communication methods would be most effective. Okay. So if it's a very complex procedure, then a simple verbal informations will not help, or even a written document as a standalone will not help. So you may require additional training to be imparted to those people. Okay, and then workers, supervisors, and managers, they should be trained in the necessary skills and made fully aware of the potential risk. And then supervisors, they need to able to recognize that the system is being followed and notice any deviations from it. Okay, so as a supervisor, when they are monitoring the worker, for during the implementation of the system, they need to fully understand the system so that they will able to identify whether the system is correctly applied or not. If people are taking shortcuts or if they are deviating from the procedure, to that extent they should able to identify. Okay, so they should also be trained. For high risk tasks, training programs based on the job analysis followed by practical application and assessment should be used. So, high risk tasks, by just communicating the procedure will not help. You need to ensure the effectiveness of your communication or effectiveness of the training. So, you may have some practical assessment. Okay, for example, for a new driver, just providing a classroom training for the driver will not be enough. Okay, you will have to provide them a practical training like on route training, and then you take an assessment. So the assessment will also help you to determine whether the drivers have fully understood the training informations. So all this will be part of developing a system. Okay, and then monitoring. So how do you know the procedure that you develop is in fact actually safe? We call it a safe procedure, right? So you need to ensure the procedure is safe and the procedure is correctly applied. So we need to monitor. So monitoring to check that employees continue to find the system workable. The system is in fact actually working as intended. The procedures laid down in the system of work are being carried out and are effective, and any changes in circumstances that require alterations to the system of work are considered. Okay, so only when you monitor, you will know whether the system is working as required, and also you will know where the system needs improvement, and so that you make the system effective. Next, permit to work systems. Now, if you look into this element 3, we have discussed about the importance of safety culture. So, how culture is linked to health and safety performance, and then the importance of risk assessment. Okay, and then the safe. systems of work or safe procedure. Okay. Now, these risk assessments, safety instructions, or the procedures, they are very much enough for most of the task or the process that we carry out. Okay, but there are certain tasks which requires, to us to take, even more, uh, you know, additional measures. Okay, because they are high risk tasks. Okay, so risk assessment, yes, we identify the risk controls, and then we develop a procedure, we provide training on people on the procedure, we monitor the effectiveness of procedure. But other than this, there are certain high risk tasks that requires, additional measures to be taken. So that is implemented through permit to work system. Okay, so permit to work is simply, again, it's a document which gives you permission before you start the work. Okay, so that document will ensure that the work is carefully assessed, and all the concerned parties, they clearly understand, the controls or the risk associated with the work, and they also sign, agreeing on those, the measure procedures or the risk. So you this permit clearly ensures that work is carefully assessed, and all the parties who are undertaking the work, they clearly understood. Okay, and then only the work will start. Okay, so again, after the work is started, and when the work is completed, so again they would sign the permit document saying that they have completed the job safely. So it is a little detailed process, but this process will ensure a careful assessment is done, particularly for this high risk task. So a formal written system used to control work that is potentially hazardous. So permit to work is a document that is used as part of the permit system. It specifies the work to be done and the precautions to be taken to ensure the worker's safety while doing it. Now, when a permit would be appropriate? Now, if I am issuing a permit for every task or for the routine task, then people will not understand the importance of permit. Okay, so if I'm like routine task, okay, so or a low risk task, then people will not highlight the importance of the permit. So permits are required for high risk tasks or any tasks that are non-routine, okay, or non-productivity tasks, like if you're doing a maintenance or testing. Okay, or where a task requires more than one party to coordinate and complete. Okay, for example, the client and the contractor, they need to coordinate, cooperate, and complete a task. So if a task requires more than one group of people to coordinate and work and complete, that would require a permit, because the permit will ensure an effective communication is set between all parties. Okay. So now if we go to the reference document. So what is a permit to work system? Okay, and what are the elements in the permit? Okay, so when are permit required? So like I said, a permit are normally considered most appropriate to non-production work. Okay. Example, maintenance, repair, inspection, testing, okay, or non-routine operations. So any task that is not your routine task. Okay. or jobs where two or more individuals or groups they need to coordinate activities to complete the job safely, or jobs where there is a transfer of work and responsibilities from one group to another. So these are the requirements where permit would be considered more appropriate. And as we move through this document, you don't have to go through this document entirely. So under the permit, there are different roles within the permit to work systems. Okay. So there are a number of roles which are commonly found in the day-to-day running of the permit to work systems. So there can be a considerable variation in the titles given to those people carrying out these roles. Okay. So what are these roles? Person requiring the job to be done. They are called as an originator or permit originator or requester. Person working under the terms of the permit. Okay. So for example, let's say there is a refurbishment, or maybe we could say a maintenance to be done, you know, in the warehouse. Okay. So as part of refurbishment project, sorry. So here, person requiring the job to be done. So it could be the person who is in charge of the warehouse. Okay. And then person working under the terms of the permit. So people who would be working, like for example, the maintenance staff or the technicians. Okay, they are called the permit user. And then person authorizing the permit for issue. Okay, so permit authorizer. For example, it could be someone who is in charge of health and safety for that warehouse. Okay, and so in some places, one person may have, may carry the role of multiple roles. Then person issuing the permit is the issuing authority. Again, it could be the person who's in charge of the warehouse, and person accepting the permit on behalf of the permit users. So sometimes let's say there are five people who would be undertaking the maintenance work, like the technicians. So on behalf of all the five people, there would be one performing authority who's accepting the permit on behalf of the permit users. Okay, like for example, could be a maintenance, a supervisor or a team leader, and then person in control of the location where work is to be carried out. So again, the person who is in charge of that warehouse area, person carrying out the checks. Okay, so who would be carrying out, ensuring that the place is safe. So they would be doing some gas test if required to check, for example, if you're working in a confined space area, you you do a testing like oxygen level testing, that oxygen level is adequate. You do some gas testing for any potential, presence of any gases or vapors. So those testing would be carried out, and person responsible for making isolations. So all the energy sources need to be isolated or cut off. Okay, it could be a thermal energy or like electrical, mechanical. So any source of energy, they need to be cut off or isolated to ensure the work is done safely. So again, you have isolating authority who is responsible for making these isolations. So these are the essential elements of a permit to work form. So going back here, so what are the features in a permit to work system? Okay. So in practice, if you look into a very simplistic approach, okay, so first it would have, like here, issue section. Okay, so first there will be an issue section. So this issue section is where you may attach your risk assessments. And this is where you specify what permit, and then the permit number, location where the permit will be used. Okay, and then activity, for which activity the permit will be applied, and then what are the hazards in that, for from that activity, what are the controls. So all these informations will be entered in the issue section, and then the person who is the in charge, for example the permit issuer, they will sign the document saying that we have carefully assessed the work and now the work can start. It is safe for the work to start and complete. Now the performing authority, the permit users, they will have to read the entire permit. They understand the risk and what controls, and then they sign. Now the work will start. So after completion of the work, again the permit users, they will sign saying that they have completed the job safely. And then the person who issued the permit will sign back saying that the permit is now is now cancelled. So this permit can no longer be used for any such task. So there are signatures clearly, showing the authority, who has the authority, and then a careful approach is done before every stages, on that high risk activity. So what are the features? A description of the work or task to be carried out and where this will be done. Okay. So here you see a description of and where it will be done. So job location, and then plant identification, and then description of the work. Okay, so this you would clearly specify in the permit, and then the duration of the permit including start and end times. Okay, so what is the validity of the permit, and within what duration, so that should also be specified. So usually permits are issued a timeline of 12 hours. Okay, so sometimes if the job cannot be completed within that the shift hour, then the permit you will apply for an extension, so where you can extend the permit up to a maximum 7 days. So the duration should be clearly specified so that all parties they understand and the required controls are in place. And then you identify all foreseeable hazards associated with the work. Okay. So hazard identifications and precautions necessary. And then control measures, a record of the isolations made. Okay, electrical or what testing is done, before the work can start. So all those information will be recorded. And then identify the permit issuer and ensure that he has completed and the equipment or areas recommissioned or returned to service. So signature of an authorized permit issuer who authorizes that the job. Okay. So when someone is authorizing through a signature, that means they will do a careful assessment of the job before they could start. So they will ensure the isolations are in place. They'll ensure the controls are identified as part of the risk assessment are in place. Okay, so controls are implemented and those carrying out the work are briefed. Okay, and then indication by the permit acceptor of whether the work has been completed or not. Okay, and then signature of an authorized permit acceptor indicating acceptance of the task and that the controls indicated have been implemented. Okay. So here a careful approach and step-by-step procedure is followed to ensure the high risk associated with this job activity is done safely. So when to use hot work like weldings and grinding, when you're working on non-live isolated electrical systems or machinery and maintenance work, so non-production work, confined spaces, Okay, so we will learn what a confined space in element number 8. So confined space, for now you could, I will show you a pictures and why it is a high risk. So you could see like working inside the storage vessel or working in the sewers. Okay. So as the term clearly identifies, it is confined. So any space which is not designed for human occupancy. Okay. Now inside this confined space, there are, what hazards, like the oxygen level could be low. Okay. There could be a presence of any toxic gases. Okay, or the person could be trapped inside the confined space. Okay, so or the ventilations or lighting would be inadequate. So for all these risks, it is, you know uh, a permit is required for a job to be done safely in a confined space. And then working at height or environments that present considerable health hazards. So one common thing with all these activities are these are all high risk activities. Okay. So with going back here, now you could clearly see the series of steps or instructions required. Okay. But there are limitations with the permit to work system. Okay. Now it is a time consuming process. Okay. So it is a time consuming process and it is just a document. A document will alone does not ensure safety. It also, clearly you should have the system in place for this permit to work to be effective. Okay. So that system should be clearly defined with, identifying any barriers within the system. Now, due to the busy nature of the work, sometimes these, issuer, without doing a physical check on the site, they may just sign the permit from their office space. Okay, so that could also be a limitation. So if a person is, issuing many number of permits in a working day, definitely they would be encouraged to, issue the permit without doing a physical check. Okay, so physical check is very important where you identify the hazards and precautions are there in place before the work can start. Okay, and then the permits should never be amended. Okay, so every people, the roles, whether it is an isolator or, the users of the permit or the issuer, they should clearly identify what their role and responsibilities. Okay, so no amendment of the permit. Sometimes during the work, if there is any a fire emergency, then the permit will be cancelled and then a new permit will be issued. So all these are, there are few barriers or challenges or limitations in the implementation of the system, but all these things should be clearly addressed in your permit to work system document. Okay, so that procedural document should clearly explain what is permit or who are the parties involved in the permit, what are their responsibilities, and how the system will monitor, that the permits are issued as per the required, process that you have in place, or how do you ensure that, the issuer is doing a physical check with, before issuing the permit, or how do you check that, people are complying with the terms of the permit. For all this there should be a monitoring system that should be in place. Otherwise it is easy for people to misuse the permit because it is a time consuming process. Okay, so as a management, they should clearly understand the importance of, implementing the permit and adequate time. Okay, adequate time and resources must be provided from the management for the proper implementation of the permit. Okay, all right. So next part is emergency procedures. Okay. So why emergency procedures need to be developed? Okay. Now, any organization, they should clearly identify what are the foreseeable emergencies that could, occur in their organization from their work activities. And for those emergencies, they should have arrangements in place to deal with those emergency. Okay. So these emergency procedures is not going to prevent the accidents from happening, but it will minimize the loss of, whether in terms of human loss or minimizing the loss in terms of financial. So it will, if emergency procedures are not there, then the situations can get from bad to worse. So in order to minimize on the severity and the consequence of an incident, emergency procedures to be developed. So they help to protect workers and any others who may be affected by a serious incident. So emergencies, it could be a fire emergency or a chemical spill emergency. Okay. Or it could also be an emergency which is external to the organization, like, adverse weather conditions. Okay. Or these COVID, like outbreak of a virus, okay, or anything within your organization from your work activity. So these emergency situations could be from, from your internal work activities, or it could be from external factors. So they will help to reduce the severity and consequences of an incident, okay, and to ensure that workers in an organization are aware of the actions they need to take. So only if I know where is my fire, exit route, then only people will use the exit route to escape before, the fire could cause, death. So people, they should have arrangements and they should communicate the procedures so it would minimize the loss and consequences. So, what to include in an emergency procedure? Potential emergencies. So, as an organization, you must identify what are the foreseeable or potential emergencies that might occur in your organization. Okay, and like I said, fire or chemical spillage or security issues like threat. Okay, like and then if people are working in outdoor, then high wind or, other adverse weather conditions, so all this should be clearly identified. And then you produce a plan, show the locations of hazardous items, might also include arrangements for visits by the emergency services to familiar themselves with the layout of the organization. And then worker must be involved. The procedure should include the nomination of competent workers to take control in the event of an emergency. Okay. So why people need training in emergency procedures? Okay. So you now developed a fire emergency procedure. Now people, they should be trained so they know where and what escape route they must use. And also, in case of any there should be practice like using the fire drill. Okay. Now this training should be considered as an overall. Okay. Now who would be contacting the emergency services? So you're going to also appoint a nominated person who will be contacting the emergency services. So that person, they should know what are the emergency numbers to contact. Okay. And then when they call them, they should give all the critical informations to them. So again, they must be trained in such way that they share all the critical informations for the emergency services for them to, arrive and immediately address the situation. And then you are going to also consider through what medium they will communicate. So for example, through mobiles or landlines, or if you're in a remote area, maybe provision of a satellite phones, so that should be clearly considered. So people, a nominated person who would be calling the emergency services, they should be trained. Okay. And then people who are in the building, they should also be trained so they are aware of the evacuation procedures and their actions would be spontaneous. So you need to practice through drills. Only through practice, people actions would be very spontaneous and shift because these are emergency situations. Every second is important, so people should be thoroughly aware of the requirements and arrangements of the procedures. Okay. And then you may also have a responsible person like a fire warden or fire marshal they also have a certain responsibilities, during a fire emergency. And then once the emergency services they arrive, they would be sharing all the critical informations like, like how many people in the building, where is the storage of your chemicals, or where potentially people could be trapped. So all information should be clearly communicated. So training should include the methods of communication between team members, training for certain designated people. Okay, so people who would be using the firefighting equipment, so they must be trained on using such emergency equipment, training how the alarm should be raised. Okay, so how to raise the alarm, and then familiarizing team members with specific hazards and information on how and when to contact the emergency services. Now, another important reason for this drill is also to test the effectiveness of your procedure or the arrangements that you have in place. Okay, so during drill, you find that it took 7 minutes for the entire team members to evacuate. So that clearly tells you that there is a delay in the evacuation process. Okay, 7 minutes is a lot of time for complete evacuations of the team. So that you identify and start to investigate why people took more time to evacuate. Okay, so and then it also helps you to understand uh, you know the effectiveness of the integrity of your hardware systems, whether alarms are functional throughout the building, or whether people were able to hear the alarm, or whether people are able to distinguish between a fire alarm or other announcements. So it helps you to test the integrity of your hardware systems, people behavior, okay, where people may have, intentionally delayed their evacuation process because they might be investigating what alarm it is, or people might be taking much time to collect their belongings. So all this will help to identify the weakness in your arrangements or procedures, and then ensure that the procedure is effective. So testing is necessary to check they work as intended. So you should make sure people know what to do, people reach their appropriate assembly points. So assembly points, a safe place where people will assemble following the evacuation from the building. Okay, so for that people they need to know where are the assembly points for that building. Okay, and then to make sure everyone can hear the alarm. Okay, if some areas of your building where alarm is not functional or not audible, so that will be identified. Sorry. And then enough assembly points have been created. So if it's a large building with a big layout, then there could be more than one assembly points. Okay, so assembly point again, your entire travel distance should be very very minimal. Okay, so wherever the place I am, from here to the safe place, it should not be a very long travel distance. Okay, especially with these fire emergencies, under 3 to 4 minutes you should completely evacuate from the place of fire. Otherwise, when you start inhaling these toxic gases and other gases from these fire, so if you see, whenever there's a fire incident, almost majority of the death is caused by suffocation or asphyxiation of these, from inhalation of these gases. So If people start to inhale, for more than 3-4 minutes, there is a strong chance that they would suffocate and die. So all this will have to be tested as part of the emergency procedures. And then the next part is the first aid needs in the workplace. Okay. Uh, so we will take a 15 minutes break and then we will continue with the first aid needs. Welcome back after the break. So next topic is on first aid arrangements. So continuing with the emergency procedures, another important aspect is first aid. Okay. So employer, their duty is to provide appropriate first aid facilities, then first aid equipments and trained first aider. Okay. So these are the key requirement under first aid, which comes under employer responsibilities. So any organizations, they need to have an appropriate first aid arrangements in the workplace, which includes first aid facilities, first aid equipments, or a trained first aider. Now, the obvious question is when you talk about a first aid facilities, okay? So when a dedicated first aid room is required or when it is not required, or when you talk about a first aid equipment, whether a first aid box is adequate or other than first aid box, we need to have other equipments like an eye wash stations or splint, wheelchair, blankets and then trained first aider. So how do you decide whether one trained first aider is adequate or you require three first aiders or 10 first aiders? Okay. So it is important to carry out a first aid assessment. Okay. So your first aid assessment will tell you what minimum first aid facilities you must provide, what minimum first aid equipments you must provide, and what minimum number of trained first aiders you must provide. Okay. So these are the key things that should be considered as part of the first aid arrangements. So now let's go into this particular document on first aid at work. Now, in this document, at the end of the document, you will have a table, okay, which talks about the number of first aiders, suggested number of first aid personnel. Okay. Now, this first aid personnel, again, there are three. So, under first aid personnel, you have an appointed person, and then FAW, which is okay, which is called a first aid at work trained personnel, and then you have EFAW, which is emergency first aid at work trained personnel. So who are they? Okay. So when we say first aid personnel, it can refer to an appointed person or a first aider trained in emergency first aid at work or a first aider trained in first aid at work. Now for your exam preparation purpose, you will not be required to mention these numbers and other things. So I'm just discussing as part of you know additional insights. So if you go to the top of the document, it clearly mentions first why it is important to provide first aid. Okay. Now first aid is, again, it is important to provide first aid so you preserve the life of the injured person or the victim. Okay. So people at work can suffer injuries or taken ill. It does not matter whether the injury or illness is caused by the work they do or not. It is important to give them immediate attention and call an ambulance in serious cases. Okay. So if you do not have a trained person, then immediately you will call the ambulance. Okay. So whether the people is injured or taken ill, even if it is not related to the work, it is important to uh, call for immediate attention. So you should make arrangements to ensure this happens. So what are the arrangements? You must have a trained, a first trained personnel, a first aid equipments, and first aid facilities. It can save lives and prevent minor injuries becoming major ones. Okay. So, who are these first aid trained personnel? Okay. Yeah. So you may have an appointed person. Okay. So appointed person is not a trained first aider. Okay. So where your assessment of first aid needs identifies that a trained first aider is not required in your workplace. Okay. So as part of your first aid needs assessment, for example, if you identify that a trained first aider is not required in your workplace, okay, then you should appoint someone to take charge of first aid arrangements. Okay, so when a trained first aider is not required in your workplace, is when it is when your workplace is a low risk workplace, and let's say you have a fewer than 25 people. Okay, so less than 25 people, and if it is a low hazard workplace, then appointed person to be is enough to meet the requirement. Okay, so this appointed person, what they will do is they will ensure they have a first aid kit in your work is suitably stocked. Okay. So the role of the appointed person includes looking after the first aid equipment and facilities and calling an emergency service when required. So they will, so the your office has a first aid box. Okay. So their role is to ensure that this first aid box is suitably stocked. Okay. And the items in the first aid box is not expired. Okay. And then they will be calling the emergency services when required, like the ambulance. Okay, so this is what the role of an appointed person. So when an appointed person will be required, or when a first aider trained is not required for a low risk workplace where you have less than 25 number of staff. Okay, now again going back to this table, if it is a low hazard workplace like office, shops, or libraries, and if you have 25 to 50 employees, then you will need to have a first aider trained in EFAW. So this EFAW is like a 1 day first aid course. Okay. Now, if you have more than 50, then at least one first aider trained in FAW, which is an advanced first aid course which goes for 2 days to 3 days. So likewise, for a higher hazard workplace, like in our scenario, which is a warehousing, okay, and where there are fewer than five, okay, then you need to have one appointed person. But for a low hazard, it is less than 25. Again, for a warehousing, if you have 5 to 50 number of staff, then you should have one first aider trained in EFAW or FAW. Now, going back to the scenario, for example, if I ask you, how many trained first aider is to be stationed in this warehouse? And remember, the suggested number of first aid personnel to be available at all times people are at work. Okay, and from the scenario, 20 workers including two shift supervisors, so there are 20 workers, and it is a high risk workplace because of these. Okay, and it is a warehouse. Okay, so you have 20 workers and who work in two 12-hour shift. So based on this data, you tell me how many number of trained first aider should be there as a minimum. Yes, I'm waiting for your inputs. 20 people working in two 12-hour shift. So from this table, identify the how many first aid personnel you need. Nobody? Try some numbers. Are you people are even listening? Or you just turning off your camera and you're I'm not going to continue until I get a response. Okay, no worries. Now the question is, see, this is the data we have. Okay. So what data we have is it is a warehouse. Okay. So warehouse, it comes under higher hazard workplace. Okay. So it is a higher hazard workplace, and then number of employees in the warehouse is 20 workers. Okay. And then number of shifts is 2. Okay. So now with these data and with the help of this table, we are going to determine the number of first aid personnel to be available at all times people are at work. Okay. So here fewer than 5. No, because the number of staff here is 20 workers. Okay. So for 20 workers, it comes under 5 to 50. So 5 to 50 warehousing. So you should have at least one first aider trained in EFAW or FAW. Okay. So now from this table, the suggested number of first aider, is 1. Okay. So 1 FAW trained first aider. Okay. But the table says the first aid personnel to be available at all times people are at work. So one first aider cannot cover both the shift. So that means you need to have two first aiders. Okay. Yes, correct. So you need to have two. So two trained FAW first aiders so that they cover both the shift. So the intent is you should have a first aider at all times people are at work. Okay. Now, other than a first aider, there are, other than the, the hazard or the number of employees, there are other factors that we should consider when deciding the number of first aiders or the first aid equipments or facilities. Okay. Yes, one for one shift and two for two shift. Now, first aid facilities, it can be, a dedicated first aid room, okay, or maybe any place which can be used to provide first aid. Okay, so it is not necessary that in every workplace there should be a dedicated first aid room. So, or just any place where a first aid can be provided. And then first aid equipment like first aid box, okay, or uh, emergency, sorry, eye wash stations, okay, or emergency shower, and then splints, wheelchair, okay. So if you want, you can look here. See, for example, eye wash stations. So where you have been exposed, to any chemicals. So this eye wash station will be required where workers are, where they are handling with chemicals. Okay. So now here, and likewise emergency showers, and then splint, to support, to prevent body movements, okay, where there is a muscle injury. So these are all other first aid equipments that you will determine based on your first aid needs. Okay. So, but as a minimum, you are going to provide a first aid box. Again, the first aid box, whether you're going to provide a small box or a medium sized box or a large box. So, everything you will decide based on your first aid needs assessment. Okay. And then here, trained first aider, one or how many numbers. So, this is what we are going to decide from our assessment. Okay. So the law may tell you, but it is always important that what is the good practice that you follow. So for example, the regulation may say that you should have at least one first aid box. But if your workplace area, the layout of your area is so large, having one first aid box, let's say in the reception area, will not be immediately accessed if it's a very large area. So in that case, you may have more than one first aid box at different locations so that people can easily access. Okay. So all this will have to be determined. So this particular slide, it talks about what to consider when deciding on first aid needs assessment. Okay. So number one, from our discussion, no, it is not like average 10 is to 1. Average, like here from this guidance document, if you see, it is like for a low hazard, okay, every 25. Okay. So 20, less 25 and sorry, 25 to 50. And then for every 50. So it's like 1 is to 50. Okay. And then here again, like 1 is to 50. But again, you have to check your local regulatory requirement. For example, here I would check the Dubai municipality requirement. Okay. Or see, in most of the requirements, they say adequate number of first aid trained personnel. So, because every workplace, different activities, there are different factors that we should consider. For example, number one here is location of your site. Okay. Now, if my site is in a remote area, like let's say the hospital is like 50 kilometers from my site. Okay. So if my site is in a remote area, then I will need to have more increase my first aid arrangements. Like for example, if the requirement says for 50 people one first aider, but in this case I may need to have two or three first aiders because the location of site is remote. I cannot rely only on the emergency team. Okay. Or sometimes you will have to notify them so that there is one emergency service is always stationed nearby. Likewise, shift patterns, because your first aider should be available at all times people are at work. And then what is the activities carried out? So accordingly, the first aid equipments you should have. Okay. So if your workers are exposed to chemical, then you will have to have a high wash stations. If there are any presence of insects or other, insects, then your first aider should have this advanced training where they can also provide first aid for insect bites. Okay. And then the locations relative, the number of workers. So how many number of workers? Do you have 10 workers or 100 workers or 500 workers? So based on the number of workers, you're going to determine how many first aid boxes, or how many trained first aider, or and also depending on the area of your workplace. Okay, so there are many factors that we will be considering, and some of the factors are also highlighted here. So in table 1 of this document, you have a checklist for assessment of first aid needs. So number 1 is hazard. So what type of hazards you find in your location, in your business? Okay. So if your workplace have low level hazards, the minimum provision is you must have an appointed person, because the hazard levels are very low. Okay. It's not like, these are high risk hazards. So you need to have an appointed person to take charge of first aid arrangements. Okay, and a suitable stocked first aid kit. So one first aid box and an appointed person. But if your workplace have higher level hazards, then you will consider providing first aiders. Okay, for low level, you may as a minimum appointed person, but for a higher level hazards, you may consider providing a first aiders, additional training for first aiders to deal with specific injuries, additional first aid equipment. So other than first aid kit, you may need to provide additional first aid equipments. Okay, and then a precise location of a first aid equipment or a dedicated first aid room. Okay, so all this, so the your arrangements will vary or depending on what type of level of hazards in your workplace. Okay, this is one factor, hazard. Likewise, the next factor is employees. Again, depending on the number of employees, your arrangements will vary. Okay, then third is accidents and ill health records. Okay. Again, depending on your accident record, for example, in your workplace, the accident rate is very low. So in that case, you may consider having a minimal provision. But if your accident rates are very high, you increase the provision. Okay. So make sure your first aid provision caters for the type of injuries, because if there are multiple incidents occurring at the same time, one first aider may not be adequate, because it is a type of your workplace where accidents occur more frequently. So when 2 3 incidents occur simultaneously, so that means you need to increase the number of first aiders or your arrangements, maybe more than one first aid box. Okay. And then working arrangements. For example, do you have employees who travel a lot, or who work remotely, or work alone? For example, your supervisor who would be traveling different sites. So in that case, you will provide them a personal first aid kit in their car. Or think about a driver. Okay, so driver may not work in one specific location. So in the bus, you should have a first aid kit, and then issue them a personal communicator like a mobile phone, to them, to call in case of any emergency, like to call the ambulance, or to call their line managers, or to call their operational control center during emergencies. Okay, and then do any of your employees work shifts or work out of hours, because you need to provide a first aider at all times people are at work. Okay, or the premise spread out, whether it's a very large layout area. Okay, then you should consider provision in each building on each floor. So if there are like 3 4 buildings within the premise, then for each building you should have a first aid arrangements. So that is working arrangements. And then if you have non-employees, like any customers or public, anybody who is not your employees. Okay, so under the regulations you have no legal duty to provide, but it is important that to preserve or to save life, you need adequate arrangements. Okay. Now going back to this question, number 6. Okay. Because of the recent incidents, you have decided to review the first aid arrangements in the warehouse. Okay. So you have decided to review the first aid arrangements because of the recent incident. Okay. What you need to consider. Okay, you're doing a review of first aid arrangement. So what you need to consider so that your first aid needs are realistic and proportionate for the warehouse workers. Okay. So as part of your review, what you will consider? Okay, for example, I will consider the number of employees in the warehouse. So based on that, I will ensure the first aid needs are realistic. So here they are not asking that I should provide two first aider, I should provide a first aid box. No, they are just asking what you will consider. So as an example, I'm saying I will consider the number of employees. Okay. I will consider the location of the site. So based on this, what other informations you will consider as part of your first aid review? Okay. You just think about for 2-3 minutes. Okay. Don't push yourself. And then we will discuss this question. Yes, the type of hazards or the risk level. Okay. Just a moment. Called. Yes, a certain number of first aid box to be available. So based on what you will decide, certain number of first aid box available. So that is the question they're asking. So first point is good. Based on the hazards, you will determine the number of first aid box available. So likewise, what other things you will consider to determine how many first aid box available or how many first aiders to be available. Yes. So I'm just trying to highlight. No, adequate lighting. No, see. Okay, so let me discuss. I think there's still some confusion. Now imagine the question is, okay, let's say that I have decided, just as an example, okay, so I have decided, uh, so during the review of first aid assessment, I have decided to to have at least 3 trained first aider, okay, comma, uh, a medium sized first aid box, and okay. So now the question is, they'll ask you, how did you or what did you consider during the review? Okay. So during the review, what did we consider? Now, as you have mentioned, okay, so the hazards, right? So workplace hazards. So that is one of the factor. Okay. So I would also put, instead of did or what factors did you consider? So one of the factor I considered is workplace hazard, when where I decided that the first aider and the first aid box requirement to be met. Now, so this is where we need to apply our understanding of the scenario. Okay, workplace hazard is good. Now, other than that, see here from the scenario, what we read is there is a collision here. Okay, and a recent FLT collision has happened. So it is also important that during your first aid review, you should have considered vehicle collision as a hazard. Okay, so specifically vehicle movement hazards. Okay, so workplace hazard is also a correct point, but to be very specific, we can also include vehicle movement hazards. Okay. Now, other than vehicle movement hazards, you can also talk about uh, the for example, here they are also handling chemicals. Okay, see here, do-it-yourself and hardware goods such as tools, equipment, and hazardous chemical. So when they are shifting the chemical from the truck to the warehouse or from the warehouse to the store, if accidentally they drop that chemical or if there is a chemical spillage, okay, so that also I would be considering. So any incidents or injuries, okay, so injuries when handling chemicals. Okay. Yes. So you see, this is what they would be expecting, because the question clearly asks you, you should support your answer where applicable using relevant information from the scenario. So from the scenario, they will test how well you have understood the scenario. So workplace hazard is good, but to be very specific from the scenario, vehicle movement hazards or injuries when handling chemicals. Okay. Then you're also going to consider the size of the workforce, okay, or number of employees, okay, in the, okay. Now, again, they will also check how well we have read the scenario. So here, like there are 20 workers working in two shift, okay. So I may mention 10 workers in the warehouse, okay, uh, for each shift. Okay. So 10 people working in each shift, and the number of shifts is, that is another factor I will consider. So how the number of shifts people are working. Okay. Then your accident history. So from this document, you see these are the points considering. So accident and ill health records. That is another point I will consider. So accident history at the warehouse. Okay. So more the number of accident, the more I would increase the arrangements. Okay. And then another point or another evidence that we take or the clue is, you see the hospital is 5 miles, approximately 8 kilometers away from the store. Okay. So I would also consider, the hospital is 5 miles. Okay, let me. So the hospital is 5 miles from the store. So this is also a point that I have considered during my review. Okay. And then what if there is a traffic? Okay. So that also you need. So even though the hospital is only 5 miles, what if there is a traffic and because of the traffic there is a delay in the emergency service arrival? So that I would also consider. So the traffic, congestion may, I would say, may delay the travel to hospital. Okay, and then your location of site. Okay, so the location of site is, you can see here, it is in the outskirts, served by good roads. Okay, so location of the site served by good roads. Now imagine if you have unpaved road, so that again will be challenging, and it will be challenging for the emergency service to arrive and to transport, the victim to the hospital. So 5 miles is okay, but this 5 miles you can travel in 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 50 minutes, depending on the traffic, the conditions of the road, and other things. So I'm also including these things under my review. Okay. Now, what if there is an absence of a first aider? Okay. So you have two first aiders. If one of the first aider is absent, or if in that case, you need to have a one more additional trained first aider. So absent of a first aider is another point I will consider during my review. It's 9 o'clock. Okay. And then work patterns were already written. And to be very specific, we can also talk about the nature of the work done. Okay. So what is the nature of the work done? So these are all mark-worthy points that you may consider in the mark scheme. Okay. So once again, I'll read the question. Please understand the question, because if you don't understand the question, your points would become irrelevant and entire 10 marks would be affected. Okay. So because of the recent incident, you have decided to review the first aid arrangements. Okay. So what you need to consider so that your first aid needs are realistic and proportionate to the warehouse workers. And the note also says you do not need to include first aid equipment. So they are not asking you to give a list of first aid equipment like the wheelchair, the splint, eye wash stations. That information is not required. They just want you to tell what you will consider. So I will consider what are the workplace hazards. I will consider the vehicle movement hazards in the warehouse. I will consider the injuries when handling chemicals. I will consider the size of the workforce. I will consider 10 workers in the warehouse for each shift. I will consider how many number of shifts people are employed in the warehouse. I will consider the accident history in the warehouse. I would consider the location of hospital from the store. I would also consider what if there is a traffic congestion or the condition of the roads. And then I would consider what if there is a first aider absence from work, or I would consider the nature of the work done. Okay. So under nature of the work done, you can also be a little more specific. Okay. For example, work done includes, FLT activities. Okay. Or there is a truck delivery. Okay. So work done includes delivery truck, right? Um, yeah. Okay. So work includes truck deliveries. So all these are the range of answers that we could consider for 10. So now any doubt in approaching this question number 6? Working hours, see whether you're working for 4 hours in a shift or 8 hours in a shift or 12 hours in a shift, that will not impact. Okay. So maximum, let's say 12-hour shift. For a 12-hour shift, accordingly, there will be, a number of first aiders. Okay. But still, if you make an assumption, you can include working hours. But again, as we know, there are no negative marking, so no harm in including. But to my knowledge, this may not be a mark worthy point, but definitely you can include. It's like a hit or miss. Okay. All right. So any doubt in approaching this question? So they are not asking how many first aiders or what are the items in the first aid box. No, they are just asking you're reviewing the first aid assessment. During review, what you will consider. Okay. All right. So with this, we will conclude for today's session. So tomorrow we will start with element number 4, and then we will discuss the question 7. Okay, so we'll discuss question 7 uh, for tomorrow's learning outcome briefing. Okay, all right. So thank you all, and I will be available online for another 10-15 minutes. So if you have any doubts, let me know. So I will catch you up tomorrow for day 10. Thank you and have a good one.
I think
Is someone saying something?
for me, little confusing. Like one or two questions
So
sounds
your voice is breaking.
just.
Hello.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you now.
So for me, it's a little confusing because I don't know, but like one or two questions, it seems to be for me. For me, it seems to be like it's similar or something like that. Is that
Yes,
normal? Like
definitely, some questions will look very identical. So that's why when we are reading the questions, read it many times and see which learning outcome the question is relating. And see, that's what the other day when I was discussing a question about indicator and a question about management failure may look like the same, but the answers are completely different. So, do you have any specific question where you have a challenge or causing confusion?
my question is like this scenario. Like even in this scenario, like we have read for like 4 to 5 days. Like if there is a new scenario, I don't know how to answer. Like I don't know
See,
how to
again,
participate.
any scenario, the format is going to be the same. The scenario is going to be about any one particular workplace. They will
Okay.
provide you all the required information like what they do in that workplace, how many people working, or the type of accident that they have included in the scenario would be different depending on the scenario. So, anyways, after we complete discussing all these questions in this particular paper, I will share another scenario. So you'll have exposure to, you know, different scenarios and different questions, but the approach is going to be the same. Okay, see, we don't need to have a knowledge on that particular workplace. Okay, all we need to know is understanding our syllabus topics and how we can, uh, uh, prepare a better answer that is also going to include information from the scenario. Okay, so this is just the initial stage. I will share one more paper probably tomorrow. You can, go through that as well. But the way how the questions are framed would be very much similar. Okay, they are not going to ask you questions that are not relevant to the topics of the syllabus. But all you need is, more familiarization with the questions and scenario and more practice. With that, it would be not be a bigger challenge. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay.